Simply put, the Fiendsmith engine is a 5 to 6 card main deck and 3 to 6 card extra deck engine that, when uninterrupted, can basically kickstart nearly any deck that it's played in. Generally, if you play enough of the extra deck requirements, you'll get to a point in every combo where you have a rank 2 plus access to a rank 6, all without using your normal summon. And then where you go from there is really deck dependent, and you'll see what I mean by that later on when I go over a couple of combos. The most important card I'm going to cover is Fiendsmith Engraver. Engraver has 3 important effects. The first is that it can discard itself from your hand in order to add any Fiendsmith spell or trap from your deck to your hand. The second is that if it's in your graveyard, it can shuffle back any other light fiend from the graveyard in order to summon itself. The third is that if it's equipped with a Fiendsmith equip card, you can target a monster on the field and send both the target and your equip to the graveyard. Pretty straightforward, right? Next up, we have its most common search target, Fiendsmiths Tract. This spell has 2 effects. The first is to add any light fiend from your deck to your hand, then discard a card. The second is you can banish it from your graveyard and perform a fusion summon for a Fiendsmith fusion monster using materials from your hand or field. At first glance, this really doesn't seem that strong, but because of the search target you'll typically play, this card becomes a huge starter. Let's move on to the extra deck for a minute now. There are 2 links and 2 fusions for the Fiendsmiths currently. First up is Fiendsmith's Requiem. This is a link 1 that requires any light fiend. It can be only summoned once per turn, and it has a quick effect in the main phase to tribute itself in order to summon a Fiendsmith from your hand or deck. It has a graveyard effect to equip itself to a non-link light fiend with the effect to give it 600 bonus attack. Second, we have Fiendsmith's Sequence. This is a link 2 that requires any 2 monsters, including at least 1 light fiend. It also has 2 effects. The first is that you can fusion summon any fiend monster by shuffling materials from the graveyard back into your deck. The second is a graveyard effect to equip itself to a non-link light fiend with the effect to make it untargetable by card effects. For the fusions, we'll start with Fiendsmith's Lacrima. This fusion requires 2 light fiends. Its first effect is a continuous effect to make your opponent's monsters lose 600 attack. If it's fusion summoned, it has a trigger effect to target any light fiend that's banished or in your graveyard, and either add it to your hand or special summon it. Thirdly, it has an effect when it's sent to the graveyard to shuffle back any other light fiend in order to deal 1200 effect damage. The last fusion we have is Fiendsmith's Desiree. This is the quote-unquote boss monster of the archetype right now. It requires Fiendsmith Engraver plus 2 light fiends. It has a quick effect on the field to negate the effects of face-up cards up to the total link rating of the equipped link monsters once per turn until the end phase, similar to a card like Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss. It also has an effect that when it's sent to the graveyard, you can shuffle back another light fiend back into your deck and target any card on the field and then send that card to the graveyard. There are 3 more honorary Fiendsmith cards that I'm going to cover in this video, and then we'll jump into the combos. The first is Moon of the Closed Sky. There's nothing too special about this card, it's simply just a light fiend generic link 2. This enables literally any deck to bridge into a Fiendsmith line provided it's able to put 2 effect monsters on the field. Next is a new TCG exclusive, Necroquip Princess. This card essentially lets you complete a lot more of the combo with only 1 light fiend. Before this card's release, if you only had 1 light fiend as your monster, you wouldn't be able to do much at all. You'd get stuck with just a Fiendsmith on your board at some point. Because of the way this card is worded, you can use a Fiendsmith with an equipped Requiem as the full fusion requirements. This essentially just puts your Fiendsmith back in the graveyard in order to use its effect, shuffling back a light fiend, the Requiem, in order to summon itself, and then you continue on. Just to note that this isn't a necessary requirement if your extra deck is really tight on space. It just means you'll need to find a way to summon another monster as link material if you're not playing this card. The third is a main deck monster. Fabled Lurie is another light fiend that, when discarded, has a mandatory effect to summon itself back from the graveyard. If you remember, Fiendsmith Tract can add any light fiend to your hand and then you discard a card. This means that when you add and discard Lurie, it gets summoned back and is the perfect fodder for your Link 1 in order to start your plays. Mostly every Fiendsmith combo is going to start the way this one does. Unless you don't have access to a light fiend, in which case there's some extra steps you have to take. I'll show that next. To start, we're going to activate our engraver in order to search Tract. Then we'll activate the Tract to search and discard Fabled Lurie. This is going to trigger Lurie to summon itself back, and then we can link it off for a Requiem. We'll use Requiem's effect in order to summon another engraver from the deck. Then we'll use our first engraver in the graveyard to summon itself back by shuffling the Lurie into our deck. This is now our first pivot point. It's worth noting that if all you care about is making the rank 6, you don't have to play any more cards in your extra deck, because as you can see, there are 2 level 6s on the field. This probably only pertains to tier elements, because this is just such an easy Beatrice. There are 2 other options you have here now. You can go for a Link 2 plus a rank 6, or you can set up an Omni Negate. Both of these alternative lines have follow-up with the Fiendsmith cards. If you want the Omni Negate, you just use the Grave effect of Tract in order to Fusion Summon. This is going to bring out Lacrima. Lacrima will trigger and bring back a Fiendsmith, and then we can link them both for a sequence. We can now use a sequence and shuffle back everything except for one Fiendsmith in order to summon a Desiree, or Omni Negate. It's worth noting that the follow-up here is the one Fiendsmith engrave and either the Sequentia or the Desiree if they leave the field during your opponent's turn. Alright, now that I've reset the board, let's go into the other line here. If you'd rather have a rank 6 and a link 2, you simply just don't need to use the graveyard effect of Tract. Here, you link both engravers off for a sequence. Now you can use the effective sequence to summon Lacrima by putting back an engraver and a Requiem. Lacrima is going to trigger on summon in order to bring back your Fiendsmith. Now you have your Link 2 and your option for a rank 6. It's worth noting that typical options here that people consider are Beatrice and Caesar. If you wanted to, you could also just make a 3 material Appaloosa instead of overlaying for a rank 6. Now I'm going to show some further lines you can do if you end up making the Beatrice because it leaves the most options available to you. If you send something like a Snake Eyes Ash or a Pydra, you can then link off into Promethean Princess and bring them back for full combo in both respective decks. Note that if you do this, you'll want to remember to use Lacrima's burn effect, as it'll replenish your resources for the following turn. Now that I've reset the board for the hopefully third and final time, I'm going to go over what happens if you already have access to your deck's engine. You can start to do some pretty toxic stuff. Sending cards like Transaction Rollback and Ghost Meets Girl in order for a basically turn skip. Sending cards like Anti-Spell and then continuing your plays for something like a Nightmare Griffin, which will set the Anti-Spell, giving you 2 on-field floodgates. Or sending a card like Angel of Blue Tears, which when you deal effect damage to your opponent, you can banish it and set a normal trap directly from your hand or deck. This is pretty easy to do because when the Lacrima is sent to the graveyard after something like Link summoning for a princess, you can trigger it, shuffling back one of your resources for the following turn, burning your opponent, and triggering the Angel of Blue Tears, sending something like Dimensional Barrier from your deck. The combo line differs a little if you don't start with Engraver or Tract. Basically, you need a way to get 2 monsters onto the field. So something like Snake Eyes Ash, Searching Poplar is a perfect example. You can link both of your monsters into Moon of the Closed Sky, which is just a light fiend that requires 2 effect monsters. And you go from there. Linking into Requiem, Requiem effect summoning Engraver. But wait, now you realize that we're kind of stuck. What are we going to do with just an Engraver? Well, this is where the new TCG exclusive comes into play. If we equip the Requiem from the graveyard, we can now contact Fuse into Necroquip Princess. This is because the requirements are a monster equipped with a monster card, which we had, and a Fiend monster card. Now, while Requiem is equipped, it's not a monster, but it's still technically a monster card, which is why we're allowed to use just those 2 as the full requirements for Necroquip. This puts our engraver in the graveyard, which will allow us to use its effect in order to reborn it. And now we're basically at the similar point in our previous combo. We had 2 level 6s on the field to make a rank 6, or we can link it to a link 2. Obviously it's not quite as strong as opening with engraver, but it's still pretty good. Honestly, any deck that has the extra deck slots should definitely play this engine. At the very worst, it's a 3 material Appaloosa or a Caesar, which is 2 summon negates. Neither of these use your normal summon, by the way. A better question would be which decks shouldn't play this engine, and that's basically only branded decks, or I guess any other deck that has a tough summon lock condition built into its playstyle. Right now, due to the NAWCQ and the EU WCQ being right around the corner, this engine will run you around 500 USD. Understandably, this is a ridiculous cost for some recycled paper. With a ban list guaranteed to be coming in August and no more huge events in the immediate future, I really do believe the cost of these cards is going to plummet. Don't get me wrong, they will still probably be expensive, but I imagine the price of engravers will probably go down from $150 to around $80. I'm also fairly confident that Fiendsmith is going to get the Pepe treatment and get hit pretty swiftly on this next list. The cards will have seen play for around a month by then, and when it likely takes 30 plus spots in the top cuts of both World Championship qualifiers, I'd be shocked if they didn't just ban Moon of the Closed Sky. It was printed as a common for a reason, so it'd be pretty justified for Konami to at the very least ban a card that players didn't shell a ton of money out for. This engine is one of the strongest and most versatile engines Yu-Gi-Oh! Has seen to date. It's definitely one that's going to take the meta by storm, and I don't think anybody can justify doubting its power or say that it's overhyped. What are your thoughts on this new TCG powerhouse? Do you think it'll get a nerf like I predicted so soon out the gate? Or do you think it's time to get into a retro format for a little while so things can cool down in modern Yu-Gi-Oh? Let me know in the comments down below. If you're interested in more combo bridges, make sure to check out the description. I'll try to include as many as I can before NAD so you can all kind of get an idea of what to watch out for. Thanks for watching. See you next time.